Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is David Shankland. I'm the director of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and I'm here representing our president, Sue Black. Baroness Black sadly is indisposed this afternoon, and she offers her apologies. And of course, we all hope that she'll be better soon. Our second recipient this afternoon of the Huxley Medal of the Royal Anthropological Institute is Professor Stephen Shennan. Professor Shennan is Emeritus Professor of Theoretical Archaeology and the former Director of the Institute of Archaeology in Gordon Square. He studied for both his MA and PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he was supervised by David Clark. From Cambridge, he moved to Southampton and then back to University College in 1996, where he is the founder of the Centre for the Evolutionary Analysis of Cultural Behaviour. Professor Shennan's early work made major contributions to the understanding of Bronze Age Europe and the application of quantitative approaches to prehistory. Then, his later career saw him become a leading figure in the development of evolutionary approaches to the past. This includes the use of neutral models of cultural change, applications of cladistic methods, the role of demography in relation to cultural evolution, and human behavioral ecology approaches to social institutions. His ERC grant, The Cultural Evolution of Neolithic Europe, exemplifies this approach. It brought the different subfields of cultural evolutionary theory and method together in an integrated fashion in order to explore the links between demographic, economic, social and cultural patterns and processes, and provided a new account of the role of farming in transforming early European societies. In order to appreciate the full impact of Professor Shennan's innovative contribution, we need to understand his outstanding intellectual strength in drawing together the different threads of anthropology, both comparatively and historically. From the outset of his career, alongside the inspiration that he has drawn from evolutionary approaches, he has been acutely aware of the writings of social anthropologists and the ethnographic work that they produce, and brought in frequent comparisons to their writings in his own publications. At the same time, however, he has always steadfastly resisted the temptation to regard changing intellectual fashions within archaeology as having necessarily solved the questions posed by their predecessors, meaning that there is a richness in depth to his writings as he looks to the intellectual conundrums posed by the previous generation, as well as those of the present, to leaven his work. Amongst his many volumes where this versatility and scholarship may be seen are Quantifying Archaeology, Genes, Memes, and Human History, and also the edited volumes Pattern and Process in Cultural Evolution, Archaeological Approaches to Cultural Identity, amongst many others. These are matched by a series of seminal articles in Nature, Current Anthropology, Science, Transactions of the Royal Society, the Annual Review of Archaeology, and many, many more. A most distinguished figure who has spent his career looking to make connections across intellectual boundaries, and now the world's leading authority on evolutionary archaeology, it is with great pleasure that we at the RAI confer upon him the Huxley Medal for 2021.
Thank you very much, David. It's, needless to say, an enormous honour to receive this award. I have to say a slightly intimidating honour given the previous recipients, and it has really made me, doing this lecture has made me think about some recent agendas which I've been working on for the last decade or so. So let's start with some ancestors of culture history. So we can see on the left there, Gustav Kusinner, who developed this idea of what he called a settlement historical approach, to archaeology, which involved tracing the traditions of known Germanic tribes back into prehistory as a basis for racist historical claims of the Germans on the territory of Europe. So, in effect, really, Cassina, you can say, is the reviled ancestor figure for culture history, whereas Gordon Childe is the revered counterpart, the opposite counterpart, if you like, who, in a sense, detoxified culture history and made this proposal in one of his very early books in 1929. We find certain types of remains, pots, implements, ornaments, burial rites and house forms constantly recurring together. Such a complex of associated traits we shall call a cultural group or just a culture. We assume that such a complex is the material expression of what today we would call a people. And really this culture historical approach, at least within the Anglo-American tradition, came to be rejected and despised in the 1960s and 70s with the advent of new archaeology. It features these days as a kind of dark age prelude to modern theoretical archaeology. But in practice, of course, archaeologists have found it indispensable. This thing doesn't seem to be... okay. So here we have one example, this map of European cultures, all the different Neolithic cultures there in the early 5th millennium BC, all those different shaded areas of the map for that time period. And here we see from the Oxford Handbook of Neolithic Europe, we can see across the top from left to right, early to late, all the different time periods, and then the different regions down the side. And you can see all those different shaded areas, all those complex names and so on, which people still find essential to describe the European Neolithic past. Here's another example, this time chronological tables as a kind of chest of drawers. And this was precisely the kind of thing that Mortimer Wheeler was criticizing in the 50s and saying, well, we've got all these timetables, but what about some trains? And in this, again, the idea is that these cultures are based on diagnostic types of artifacts, such as those we can see here for Neolithic Central Europe on the left, and then southern Scandinavia in the Neolithic on the right. So it seems to me that they clearly provide organizing principles that we still need, but I think for a long time we've not been sure what we should do with them. One person who was very sure about what to do with these ideas in the late 60s was David Clarke in his Analytical Archaeology, when he proposed a general systems theory approach to cultural history, which was revolutionary and which has, in effect, never really been followed up, because the Clarke approach was overtaken by the kind of Binfordian new archaeology, which prevailed for the next 20 or so years. But Clarke had a lot of relevant ideas to the understanding of culture history, and those ideas are still relevant today. And one of his most important ideas in, as it were, updating culture history is that groups are not monothetic. In other words, as you can see in the top left there, you can see a series of entities and their attributes. In the traditional view, every entity has to have all the attributes. And Clarke's point was that is not necessarily the case at all. We have these polythetic groups in that some entities will have some of these traits and others will have different subsets. In fact, this was a development borrowing of the idea of Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances. And so here's just a couple of examples of Clarke's thoughts about cultural evolution. So what we can see over Over on the far left here is a situation where you get a culture originating at a certain point. It would split into two separate cultures. But Clark also emphasized that you could potentially read this diagram in the opposite direction, so that separate cultures could merge into a single one. And over on the right-hand side, you have Clark's idea about how cultures might crystallize into existence. So we have a whole series of these different features, flint types, pottery types, burial types, and so on, all with different origins in different places. And Clark suggested that somehow these came to be integrated into a single system. So this system then, as it were, crystallizes, in this case, into this corded-ware culture. Now, as I've said, the Clarkian approach was never taken forward. And in effect, these kinds of ideas of cultural traditions and the factors that account for cultural traditions and explaining how they come into being and so on, these really came back into archaeology, in effect, via the work of Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman, and then Boyd and Richardson. Because these people developed the foundations of a mathematically based cultural evolutionary theory that explained stability and change in cultural traditions, but based on the tools of population genetics. And in fact, there's an interesting related perspective which has grown up alongside and is now increasingly integrated with the previous approach. This approach developed by Dan Sperber in his book Explaining Culture, but actually initially published in the Societies and the Institute's journal, Man as it then was, in 1985, with his article on the epidemiology of representations and his idea of cultural cognitive causal chains. And his ideas have continued to be developed by a variety of scholars, most recently by Olivier Morin with his book, How Traditions Live and Die. So this kind of general evolutionary approach provides a set of ideas which I have argued, in effect, can bring to life again the kind of interest in cultural traditions that archaeologists had at the very beginning of the discipline. So if we're talking about a theory being evolutionary in Darwin's sense of descent with modification, then it requires a number of features. First of all, there has to be mechanisms for generating variation. Then there have to be mechanisms for transmitting that variation through time, creating ancestor-descendant links. And then there have to be mechanisms for sorting that variation so that some variants increase in frequency while others decrease and disappear. In other words, this is a framework for understanding both history and adaptation. And particularly at this time, this was really a time when archaeology, in the more narrow sense, in the Anglo-American world, was rejecting history with the new archaeology, and then rejecting adaptation with the post-processual perspectives that came after that. So here we have this pictures of genetic and cultural transmission. Obviously, on the left, we have genes being descended from parents to their offspring, whereas human culture has a much greater number of different routes of descent, not just from parents, but from other kin, from non-kin, from peers, and even from offspring to the older generation, and increasingly so these days, in fact. And one of the things these approaches brought out was the possibility of these different kinds of cultural sorting mechanisms in terms of affecting whether a particular feature is passed on or not. So, for example, on the left here, we have social learning going on, but with a conformist bias. People adopting the principle, when in Rome, do as the Romans. On the right there, we have the potential for novelty bias. Individuals who are rebels in their culture who deliberately seek to adopt features that are new and rare in their particular culture. And then over on the right-hand side, we can see that people can be influenced by prestige in terms of the topics, in terms of the interests they pick up, the way they do things, and so what they wear and so on. But equally, possibly, we can also see that individuals are influenced by the success of certain people in terms of whether they adopt a particular set of traits or attributes. And in this broad context, in this 1997 paper, Boyd and colleagues suggested there were these 4 theoretical possibilities with cultural traditions. One was cultures as species, isolated from one another and tightly integrated, which was the traditional culture history view. Then he suggested you could think of cultures as a collection of ephemeral entities, the other extreme, and perhaps something like present-day short-lived fashions would correspond to this idea of cultures. And then he suggested the 2 more interesting possibilities. The first one, nearer cultures as species, this idea of cultures as hierarchically integrated systems with distinct core traditions and a periphery subject to cross-cultural transmission. So, for example, in this top picture here, we can see these circles represent the cultures, and you can see that particular varieties of a set of attributes are passed on through 2 different groups from their ancestors, but there are certain traits which are picked up from one culture and adopted into another. And then the 4th possibility that was suggested was this idea of cultures as collections of coherent units or packages with independent evolutionary histories. And that's what we have here. So we can imagine a set of traditions here being passed on. Let's say those traditions associated with particular agricultural techniques coming by one route. And let's say, and down here, we have a different set of traditions, let's say ceramic traditions, being adopted from some other source and coming into this culture. So any given culture, as we can see, this culture is represented by the dotted circles here, is made up of different packages of features which have different histories and potentially histories from different places. And one last sort of element in this whole approach to cultural evolution is the importance of population thinking. So there are no ideal types, as was suggested by, and implicit indeed, in the early culture history. Effectively, there is only variation. So what we have here, in fact, is we have communities of practice, and those communities of practice produce variability, and various features that variability is passed on through time and accumulates and changes. So in this light, I think we should see cultures as ways of life, if you like, made up of practices in different areas of life, transmitted by various routes, potentially from a range of sources, and affected by various pressures that influence what is and what is not successful for the people concerned. And what I now want to move on to is some of the changes that have occurred in the last 10, 20 years in terms of productively employing these ideas to address culture change in prehistory. On the one hand, first, there is the growing availability of archaeological big data and corresponding methods of analysis to identify past population and cultural patterns. And this is the work that I've been particularly associated with. And then we have the ancient DNA genomic revolution and what it tells us about the ancestry of past biological populations. So why should demographic patterns matter for these sorts of cultural evolutionary approaches? Well, clearly, at a world scale, in a sense, they don't. If we look at the world scale, if we look at a world population history, effectively at this scale, population has been flat for most of the last 10,000 years and has just started to increase in the last few hundred. So there certainly isn't much going on there. Even if we look at a European scale, as here, focusing on the interval between about 5,000 BC and 500 BC, we have a couple of kinks in the picture there, but basically we have a gradually rising smooth trend in the population pattern. But if we look more closely, then at the regional scale, then things begin to change. So, but if we're going to look more closely, we need new tools, and we need lots of data. And those data are radiocarbon dates. So the basic assumption is that to a first order of approximation, if large numbers of dates are available, there should be a relationship between the number of dates falling within a given interval in a given region, or their summed probabilities, and the amount of human activity, which depends on the population size. And that is what we can see in this picture here, a picture of summed several thousand radiocarbon dates summed together, and we can see the arrival of, essentially, the arrival of farming here, and population rises before declining again. And the point about that picture is that it is associated with the development of a method for establishing whether these patterns are statistically significant. We were able to show that you could statistically identify departures from a trend and establish whether those departures were real or not. So here is another example of the same kind of thing. This is a population history of Britain from about 4,000 or so BC down to 1,000 or so AD here. And what you can see, the grey line is essentially what you would expect if the population slowly rose with the arrival of farming and then carried on essentially at a flat carrying capacity sort of level. And what you can see from the actual picture is that there are very marked positive and negative deviations in that picture. And this particular picture now is based on over 30,000 radiocarbon dates. So we need a lot of information to get detailed pictures. But archaeologists are naturally suspicious about the methods that they use, especially new methods. And there has been a lot of questioning of the validity of this kind of approach. And one of the things that we did right at the beginning is to say, well, we need to look at how these patterns correlate with patterns in other records of human impact, such as the extent of forest clearance, for example. So we would expect that to be, if we have the pollen records, we would expect to see, as populations go up, we would expect to see more forest clearance for agriculture and so on. And this is what we see in Britain. There's the arrival of farming here. We can see population goes up and declines, as we've just seen. And if we look at the pollen picture, which is a lower resolution picture than ours, nevertheless, you can see a decline in the deciduous forest and an increase in the open part of the environment, which gives us some confidence to suggest that, in fact, these are, if you like, genuine trends that we're picking up here with our population proxy. So let's have a look at explaining these kinds of population fluctuations. So if we look here first over on the left to the picture, to the box here defining the period from about 4,000 BC down to about 3,000 or so, a bit before 2,000 or so BC. It's that area here. And what we see, that area here, corresponds essentially to the greater part of this picture here. But this is a population picture, and this is a picture based on the summed probabilities of actually directly dated cereal grains from Britain at this time. And what you can see is that there is a rise and decline in the number of cereal grains. And in fact, this idea that Stevens and Fuller suggested, in fact, it looks as though Neolithic farming failed, and our population proxy actually reflects that rise and fall in the success of cereal agriculture. Or here is another example from a different region. Again, we can see here an area of period of significantly high population contrasted with the next period, which was much lower. And what we see is, if we compare these periods in terms of their domestic animal bones, we see that the average proportions of domestic animals drop by nearly a half between these two periods. So there's a major increase, a major significant decline, effectively, in the subsistence, in the animal part of the subsistence economy between these two periods. So what I think we can deduce from these kinds of pictures is that these regional population patterns give us a measure of the success of local socioeconomic systems, with periods of decline corresponding to subsistence crises. Now I want to move on to saying a bit about the ancient DNA evidence. And one of the points I just want to emphasize with this slide from David Reich's book here is his point that for ancient genomes, every individual contains a capsule of their ancestors. So if we start in the present here and go back 15 generations, we can see that people have 32,000 genealogical ancestors, 2 to the 15. And if we look here, if we look on this side, this is the number of ancestral stretches of DNA that contributed to you. So 15 generations back, we've got 1,112 stretches of DNA that contributed to you, a 3% sample of those genealogical ancestors. But effectively, even one individual is giving you a really significant sample of the ancestry of the population of which that individual was a part. So, of course, again, if we're thinking now in terms of how these patterns might relate to the cultural patterns, then, as we've seen, there's no in principle reason for their roots to coincide, but in some circumstances, they might well coincide. So what I want to do now is look at a few examples of how this works by looking at some of our archaeodemographic and then linking those to the genomic results to look at booms and busts in the spread of farming into Europe. So here is the classic picture. We can see farming originating here in Anatolia around about 7,000 BC, spreading up to southern Scandinavia 3,000 or so years later, with these different colors representing different cultures, of course, the indispensable cultures. But if we just focus on these areas where these blue dots are, and then if we look at in the next slide, what we see is that with the arrival of farming in those different areas, here and here and here and here and so on, we see a massive rise in population associated with these early farmers. And you can see also that in many cases there is also a massive fall in population that follows on, which we'll come to in a few minutes. If we look at the Mediterranean region again, this is not just a Central European pattern. We find exactly the same picture here. So we can see the date of the origin of farming earlier to the east and later to the west. And we can see these big demographic fluctuations that followed on that arrival. But I want to focus now in a little bit more detail at a couple of the early bits of that expansion. First of all, starting off with that Southeast European so-called Starchevo-Kurish culture there in Southeast Europe. And what we can see in this little picture here on the right is the expansion of population associated with the arrival of farming in that area. We can see it almost immediately dropped down. There was almost immediately a bust before it rose again, and there followed another bust. And if we look at the now genomic patterns for the spread of farming into Europe, what we see is here, these inverted red triangles represent the genomes of the early farmers in Anatolia, and the inverted yellow triangles here represent the genomes of the first farmers in Central Europe. And you can see they're very close to those of their Anatolian ancestors. And these pictures here, these areas here, correspond to the genomes of the native indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in different parts of Europe. And there is a slight shift in this direction among these first European farmers, but not very marked at all. So the initial spread of farming into Europe was a demographic expansion of farmers of Anatolian origin, and there was little admixture with local foragers, probably because their densities were actually very low. So what we have here is a picture in which farmers have more children, more of them survive to be parents themselves, farming populations expand, and farming cultural attributes increase as a result. But the system is dependent on the continuing cultural transmission of farming-related and other knowledge from the older to the younger generation. Without that continued cultural transmission through the generations of the relevant skills and knowledge, this system would collapse. So the farming system, the culturally transmitted farming system, is fundamental. It might also be the case that these people might end up in an area where farming no longer paid off, and that's something which we will look at a bit later on in this talk. So what's the relation between cultural and demographic patterns here? Are we dealing with cores or are we dealing with packages? I think we can see the early Neolithic Balkans as an example of the core model, in that we have this material culture traditions are being transmitted together with the plant and animal species and the knowledge needed for successful husbandry, and this strong correlation with the genomic evidence for population dispersal. So the genes and the cultural traditions are transmitted in parallel. So I now want to move on to the next stage in this spread of farming into Central Europe, as the point indicated by that red dot there, which represents the point of origin of this linear band ceramic or linear pottery culture, which then spread farming into Central Europe. And here we see the origin of new cultures through cultural splitting, but not genetic splitting. So just to remind you, here's our Central European farmers. These here, you can see they're extremely close, as we've seen, to their Anatolian ancestors. There's very little evidence of any sort of admixture with the local hunter-gatherers. But what we see actually culturally is a process of splitting, a process of cultural phylogenesis, if you like. So on the edge of this Central European area, we get this linear pottery culture forming and differentiating. And in the southeastern Europe area, which was previously characterized by the Starchevo-Kurish farmers, we get the development of this so-called Vinci culture, the successor to the Starchevo in Southeast Europe. And we can see here that this particular, again, if we look at the demographic picture involved in this, what we see here is, again, we've already seen these, the two booms and busts in our early Starchevo farmers, but this rapid and big expansion in the Vincia is following on another bust here before this Vincia culture, so-called, develops. So we have here the origin of the LBK, farming moving into a new environment. And we get a loss of variation in culture and also in subsistence features, for example, in the kinds of crops that were cultivated. So we have here a cultural version of founder effect and drift. So if we imagine that large circle over on the left there as representing the variation within the Starchevo-Kurish culture, we have these new communities at the frontier of that distribution budding off, but only picking up a selection, a non-random selection of the variation in the founding population. And as we get the transfer from one generation to the next, as shown by the red arrow here, then what we see is, even in that case, some of the existing variation then gets lost in the next step as the next settlement is founded. And it's quite clear, I think, that that is one of the processes that is going on with the start of this expansion of farming into Central Europe. So we see this linear bandcramic culture, another strong core, a high degree of uniformity in all aspects of culture and subsistence from Hungary to Belgium, and overwhelmingly farmer genomes. And you can see here, this is the archaeological traces of their longhouses that we find regularly right across these 1,500 kilometers from Hungary to Belgium, represented by these reconstructions here. And these represented the kinds of settlements that you find made up of these longhouses. But one of the interesting things about these first farmers is how restricted they were. So the sites are only found on fertile, loess soils in areas with a narrow range of temperature and precipitation conditions. So we have these small areas, relatively densely occupied through the employment of quite intensive forms of agriculture with a limited range of crops. So if we look here, we can see on the map, it's these sort of yellowy-greeny areas, which are the areas which would have been suitable for agriculture of an LBK type based on their temperature, precipitation, and soils. So we can see, in fact, most of this area, this is Germany, most of the area would not have been suitable for these farmers. But in fact, we can see the areas they actually occupied were only these areas outlined in black here. So there were huge areas of potentially suitable environments, so far as we can see, that were never actually occupied. But this seems to have been a very fragile farming system. So as we can see here with these pictures here, again our radiocarbon pictures, we can see farming arriving boom and bust, similarly up here. And we can also see that at a much more local scale in that picture on the top right, which is based on the number of excavated and dated houses in a very small area of Germany. We get precisely the same picture. So we get this LBK population boom followed by a bust, leading eventually to cultural changes. And one of the interesting features of these LBK busts, as have been pointed out by many, is we get the evidence for these massacre sites in some parts of the area. So Talheim there, this massacre pit with the individuals jumbled up there. This enclosure at the site of Aspern-Schletz in Austria with an estimated more than 67 individuals scattered in the enclosure ditch. And we then a more recent discovery, this mass grave at the site of Schöneck-Kilienstetten, in southwest Germany, where you can see in the pictures the evidence of the fractures in the long bones and the depression fractures in the skulls of the individuals. And also here things like the cut marks in these bones. So what we get then is actually the demise of this LBK culture. And if we look now at the western end of this farming distribution, so we're looking at the present day low countries roughly. So the hatched areas here, these little hatched areas, are the areas that were occupied by the LBK farmers, whereas the dots represent sites which were occupied in the second half of the 5th millennium BC. They belong to this so-called Michelsberg culture. This was a new cultural expansion from the West, inferred by the archaeologists, but now increasingly confirmed by the ancient DNA as well. So we have a new cultural expansion of groups with a higher proportion of hunter-gatherer admixture with a different agricultural strategy. Settlements were more widely dispersed and at lower densities. And we can see just an example of this kind of ceramic assemblage up here. And we can see here in this picture, this scattergram for the mitochondrial DNA patterns, we can see the Michelsberg pattern clearly very distinct from the LBK pattern. So looked at in our larger picture again, what we're looking at now is this period here, about 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago. These upright triangles here of individuals dated to this time, you can see that their genomes have effectively moved much more away from those of their Anatolian ancestors in the direction of these indigenous hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe. And we get a little vignette of that at this site of the Blätterhöhle in the 4th millennium. We find 3 individuals that isotopically had farmer diets. These had 40 to 50% hunter-gatherer ancestry, whereas another individual who had a hunter-gatherer dietary signature was closer genetically to hunter-gatherers, but was also admixed with around 27% of ancestry from farmers. So the farmers' comeback can be seen also in this slide here. So we can see the chronology going from 4,500 down to 3,000 BC. And in this period, particularly in this period of 500 years or so, we see an increasing proportion of hunter-gatherer ancestry in these farming populations. So then what happens next then in this European context? So here we move on to really, I suppose, the most high profile of discussions about the significance of ancient DNA evidence over the last few years. So you can see on the map, we've got areas where you find this so-called Bell-Beaker culture, and over on the right, we've got those brown areas of the so-called corded-ware complex. We can see in the middle there that there are some areas that had both, and we can see below that corded-ware area, that blue area, the so-called Yamnaya culture occupying the Russian steppe there. And you can see just an example slide of some of these features of this Yamnaya or Pitgrave culture, and you can see that grave in the bottom right shows why it's called the Pitgrave culture. And there were a couple of very high-profile papers, in particular this one by Hark et al. And another parallel one by Allentoft et al. At the same time, with the provocative title, Massive Migration from the Steppe was a source for Indo-European languages in Europe. And the basis of the argument here is that we can see down here we have our Middle Neolithic populations here, the descendants of the Anatolian farmers, and up here we have the genetic pattern, the genome pattern of these Yamnaya steppe dwellers, and here we have the genomic pattern of the Cordidware, very, very far removed from these Middle Neolithic, purely, effectively local hunter-gatherer and Anatolian descended farmers. And you get something similar with this picture here of the genomics of the Belbeka culture. Again, we can see the steppe early Bronze Age here, the Yamnaya pattern. We can see the Cordidware here. And then we can see a lot of these different Belbeka individuals from Central Europe, from Britain and various areas, very, very close to the Cordidware and Yamnaya pattern. But here, not universally, because some of these Belbeka individuals from Iberia, for example, and from southern France, do not share the same pattern. But this particularly, the first paper about the massive migration and the expansion from the steppe led to these newspaper headlines like this one: Stone Age genocide, vengeful prehistoric invaders who changed Europe forever. A mysterious race of invaders who embarked on a genocidal killing spree after arriving in Europe thousands of years ago, changing the content forever, were probably motivated by a desire for vengeance, an archaeologist has said. So it doesn't actually say there. I found the headline, I didn't see the rest of the article, so maybe the archaeologist should remain nameless, although I have an idea who it is. Since then, there's been a certain amount of rowing back. And one of the interesting things was that those genocidal invaders were supposed to be horse-riding pastoralists coming in. But more recently, again, new genomic evidence, but this time genomic evidence for horses, has shown that there was actually no link between horse riding and this steppe genome expansion westwards. And again, what we can agree is that there is genomic evidence of male-biased migration, but the specifically Yamnaya male Y chromosome haplotype has not yet been found in any of 32 Cordidware male burials, and in fact only in 3 Belbeka burials. Moreover, it's been shown that the association between so-called steppe genes and Indo-European languages has not turned out to be clear-cut, so that some of the earliest people known to have spoken Indo-European languages do not seem to have shared these steppe genes. Moreover, there are marked differences between Yamnaya and Cordidware in their pottery, and similarities between Cordidware and preceding so-called globular amphora pottery. But the genomes of those individuals associated with globular amphora material culture have no steppe elements. So the process is more complicated than those initial claims were suggesting, perhaps unsurprisingly. But nevertheless, we can see very clear evidence of Cordidware expansion into southern Scandinavia. So what we see here is the green parts of these genome summary bar charts represent proportions of steppe genes in individuals from those different areas. And what we see again is we see a boom and bust pattern here. So what we see in Scandinavia, we see farming arriving, population expanding to a peak, and then crashing to a bust before rising again to a peak. And the individuals characteristic of this period associated with the first peak are those individuals that we've seen admixed Anatolian farmers and local hunter-gatherers, whereas the individuals of the Cordidware are these individuals here associated with the strong element of steppe genomes. So what we can say again is that we have cultural chains via immigration indicated by gene flow after a bust has created new opportunities. And to quote the authors of the paper, the step ancestry seen in these Scandinavian corded-ware individuals can be explained only by migration into Scandinavia. But this is also reflected in the pottery contacts as well. And for those of you puzzled by this term grog, which maybe you're thinking it's a Neolithic drink, it actually refers to the context where the tempering of pottery is made of crushed pottery, crushed vessels, which have been destroyed and ground up into grog. But what's interesting here, again, very much against the spirit of these horse-riding invaders, is that some of the corded-ware groups in the East Baltic gave up agriculture and became hunter-gatherer fishers, but they continued producing pottery similar to the other corded-ware assemblages in the region. And again, if we look at this Scandinavian pattern, what we can see through time here, not just the Scandinavian, the corded-ware pattern more generally, again, going down from 3,000 to 2,200, what we can see is a gradual increase through time in the proportion of mixed hunter-gatherer farmer ancestry and effectively the kind of depletion of that steppe ancestry. We can see that steady trend over the life of the corded-ware. So a lot of people have discussed what on earth this corded-ware pattern represents. And here is an example of a diagram from Martin Voorholt, who has suggested that we should see indeed the corded-ware precisely in David Clarke's polythetic way. There are different patterns for burial rituals, different patterns for settlement patterns, different patterns for pottery production, and the different communities are integrated in different ways and are similar in different ways related to those different cultural spheres. So I think there is indeed massive spatial variation in corded-ware material, culture and practices, but it does now need to be linked to the incontrovertible ancient DNA evidence for male-biased migration. And without that, we would still be talking about the spread of new ideologies and symbols. So I now want to, in the last part of this talk, just focus on what happens when we have a bit more data, effectively. So we saw earlier that with the demographic fluctuations, that quantities of data mattered in terms of being able to trace patterns locally and in detail. And the same is becoming clear as the number of genomes analyzed increases and as their chronological density increases. So this particular study, which came out a couple of months ago by Papats et al., as you can see from the picture at the bottom there, has a lot more genomes in its analysis than previous ones. And they have looked at it really in a kind of classic culture history sort of way, in fact. So what we have here along the bottom is these successive archaeological cultures for this area of the Western Czech Republic, Bohemia. And what we can see is over here, we can see those different line thicknesses representing different degrees of sort of radicalness in the cultural break. And we can see these going along here. And then these here, these black arrows here, correspond to what archaeologists have always thought of as outside influence from other areas onto this area. And what we see is that there is an awful lot of correlation between the genomic patterns, which we now get in detail, and those traditional culture historical patterns. So as you can see, the yellow ochre here corresponds to this Neolithic ancestry. The blue is the Western hunter-gatherers. The pale blue is Eastern hunter-gatherers. And then we have the steppe elements. And we can see with these successive cultural inputs, starting over here with these inputs from both the southeast and the north, we get an increase here in the proportions of these hunter-gatherer genetic components here, the Western and the Eastern hunter-gatherers. And we get a further import here in this period just a bit before 3000 BC, again from both the southeast and the northeast. And here is when we have the major import of the corded ware, but note on their picture coming not via these Yamnaya steppe pastoralists, but through here, through the forest steppe cultures of northeastern Europe, we get this very big increase in steppe genomes, which gradually declines over the following several hundred years. And we get a rather different picture here again when we see, in this particular case, with the Belbeka input, which we see in this area, also associated with a variation in the genetic input, and in particular with rather more of the Western hunter-gatherers. And even that is not the end of the story, because there seems to be some further input at the very beginning of the Bronze Age. So there's a pretty strong association here between these cultural shifts associated with external population inputs. But that's not to say that there is uniformity here. There's a lot of variation, so both culturally and in the genomes. So here, for example, what we have is the different cultures from early to late here. The squares represent females, the circles represent males. And here, if we look at the corded ware, for example, we can see some very striking genetic diversity between these individuals who are associated with corded ware material culture, and that applies mostly to the females, but also to the males, and it then narrows down in the subsequent phase and is different again when we come to the Belbeka phase. So there's a lot of variation in this. We're not talking about something that is, as it were, singular and uniform. So I think we can see population fluctuations here, but culturally, are we dealing with cores or packages? I'm not sure that we really know at this point. So this is a study which has focused in on a very small bit of that area and looking at variation in corded ware assemblages and in terms of their different pottery types in this case. And you don't need to look in detail, but to see the point that there's a lot of variation from one site to the next in terms of their material inventories. So I think we can probably be fairly safe in assuming that there is a whole variety of different cultural packages being absorbed and becoming part of this corded ware. Perhaps not in the same way as Clark suggested, because the dating shows that he was wrong, but nevertheless in an analogous fashion. But whether we're talking about cores or packages, it's clear that the demographic processes are fundamental to understanding what's going on. And in fact, now I want to kind of interject something that points in a different direction and emphasizes the importance actually of cultures. And this was some work which we did in the context of the previous ERC project. So if we look at these pictures over here, what we have is summed radiocarbon date probabilities for lots of different Neolithic cultures. And you can see that some of them seem to be short-lived and others seem to be longer-lived when we look at their axes in terms of numbers of years along this axis. But if, rather than dealing with numbers of years here, we turn our axis into one in terms of numbers of standard deviations of the distribution away from its mean, what we see is that all these archaeologically identified cultures, they may have different durations, but they have the same shape. So there's a characteristic shape here in these macroevolutionary patterns of cultures. So even if we can, as we saw in the previous slide, identify when we really focus the microscope down, we see a lot of detail, but that doesn't mean that these macroscopic patterns don't exist and are not genuine in some kind of way, I would suggest. So again, I say the rise and demise of cultures is very often associated with rises, expansions, and then declines in local populations. And those local declines may offer opportunities for the expansion of adjacent groups and or for the reformulation of socio-cultural patterns. So let's get to some conclusions. So I think identifying, dissecting, and explaining cultural historical patterns is a legitimate and even fundamental endeavor for archaeologists in the 21st century. Between them, the ancient DNA and the archaeological population proxies show the fundamental role of demography in understanding the dynamics of both cultural and genomic change. The standard cultural evolutionary models tell us about change processes in particular cultural lineages, but do not really tell us much about boom and bust processes. So I think there's a lot more potential to explore the standard evolutionary models in terms of looking at cultural trajectories, and I've done some of that in work which I've not talked about here. But ultimately, that isn't going to tell us about the factors involved in the booms and the busts, I think. And here, again, I think obviously archaeology has a major contribution to make at the macro level, especially now we have the ancient DNA information. But to realize that contribution, we need this chronologically high-resolution data on the specifics of cultural patterns and on population, subsistence, and environment so that we can generate and test models of their relationships. And that's what we haven't got as archaeologists. So the geneticists got their act together ages ago in producing public databases where they report and leave all their results and make them available to other people for analysis. Archaeologists have never really done that. The traditional picture for archaeology is for the excavator of a site never to get round to publishing it and then to die before the site is published, leaving it for somebody else to try and pick up the pieces. We're trying to change that now. Things are moving on. The younger generation do believe in these so-called FAIR principles about data access. But there is a long way to go, I think, if we're actually going to generate and test models. And one of the things that we're trying to do now is try and address some of that agenda. So recently, a group of us at Gothenburg, UCL, and the other institutions you can see there were supported by a European Research Council Synergy grant, this COREX project, from correlations to explanations towards a new European prehistory. And really the idea of that project, obviously very ambitious, is to try and deliver the agenda shown in this picture at the top, identifying demography, transmission dynamics, population size, innovations, looking at how migration and genetic admixture and cultural connectivity tie together, and how those in turn relate to subsistence strategies and environmental change. So that's a big agenda there, and I'm sure that we won't deliver more than a small fraction of it, but I think this is the direction we should be going in terms of producing a European prehistory, which is actually both relevant to the present and does justice to the material potentially available to us. And I'd just like to finish by thanking all the various colleagues who worked with me over the last decade and more in these various projects, and not least finally my Institute of Archaeology colleagues for their very supportive and stimulating environment that they've provided over the years. So thank you very much.